Good morning and welcome, everyone. I'm Sue Kohler. I am the chair of the Third Age Committee, and it's wonderful to see you here. And welcome to everyone who is on live stream, and also welcome to those who catch up with the program later on Westminster's YouTube channel. You can see a lot of our programs on Westminster's YouTube channel. Today's schedule, we will have David Shin lead us in prayer, followed by Dwayne Lookingbill introducing our guest speaker today, Matt Skinner, followed by Matt Skinner's presentation and introduction to podcasts. I'm ready with my pen. I'm going to be taking lots of notes. After Matt's presentation, then we will talk a little bit about future programs, and at the end we'll have time for some conversation, coffee, and cookies here in the Meisel room. I'm afraid those of you on live stream are will have to get your own coffee and cookies. David, will you start us out?
Good afternoon, everybody. It's good to be here. Let's join our hearts together in person as well as online in prayers. Let us pray. Gracious and loving God, we are grateful, Lord, to be in your house this day. As we gather now both in person as well as in the comfort and safety of our own space and our time, we give you thanks for the journey of Lent that you are taking us on. As we approach closer, O Lord, to Easter, that we will journey through this Holy Week, that your Spirit will continue to walk with us as we come to this Wednesday and prepare for Maundy Thursday and Good Friday and Holy Saturday and also Easter Sunday. We ask, O God, that your Spirit abide in our hearts as we grapple and hold that your love in our hearts. We ask, O God, that your Spirit be among us now as Matt will speak to us. May the wisdom and experience that he has in the technology and excitement, Lord, fill us, and to know that we continue to walk with you. And this we pray in your name. Amen.
I think most of you know I did neglect to mention that it is masks optional during the week here at Westminster. So, Matt, I don't mean Matt, I mean Dwayne.
I'm Dwayne Lookingbill, and I'm a member of the committee for this Third Age ministry. And I really enjoyed working with this group. I think we have one more program for our year. And I would encourage you to not only take advantage of our forums, but come join us in this ministry. If you can serve on the committee or ask others, tell them what we're sharing here, that would be a good thing to do. But I get to introduce our presenter, Matt Skinner, who is professor of New Testament at Luther Seminary in St. Paul. This is his 20th year on the faculty there. Since the beginning of 2020, 2 years ago, he has also served as scholar of adult education here at Westminster. He supports the adult education ministries here mostly through his teaching. And during the pandemic, he has focused especially on making programming more accessible to our congregation and neighbors through digital media. He was born and raised in the San Francisco Bay Area, has 3 children, and 1 very affectionate Labrador Retriever. Matt.
Well, good morning. It's an honor to be invited to do this. It's very rare when somebody who teaches New Testament for a living is asked to speak about something like a podcast or technology or something like that. I spend most of my time in the first century, so this is great. I feel really kind of dialed in, kind of cool to be able to talk about podcasting with all of you, which, on the one hand sounds like, why do we need why do we need Matt Skinner here to talk about podcasting? But it gets into questions of how does faith formation happen? Where do we get our information from? How do we think about the ways in which we're fed spiritually? And how does that happen, of course, sometimes on site, but as we've learned, especially in the last 2 years, what does that look like to make it available and accessible in different places? And podcasting is a way of thinking about that. So I will, I'll use my screen from time to time to show some things. I'm going to take my own photo off of that for now, just for the sake of all of us, I think, most of all. So podcasting, what in the world is it? Somebody said at the beginning, you're going to tell us what it is, right, before you talk more about it. Absolutely. So that term podcast is a play on the term broadcast, and all of us know what broadcast television used to be, back when you used to get your television through the air. We still have broadcast media, stuff that's available widely. Even that term broadcast was originally actually an agricultural term to describe how seed would have been sowed, that broadcasting was originally seed that was spread widely or to everybody, or to all places without really much regard for narrow, nice rows. And when electronic media got started with television and even some radio, broadcasting was the term they used to describe stuff that would become widely available. You might remember something called Ipods. These are around maybe 20 years ago. They don't even make them anymore, which is the horrible thing. It looked about the size of your phone, perhaps, and was a means of carrying music around with you. It was, in some ways, like a portable cassette player, except it could hold, of course, thousands and thousands of albums with you. With these iPods came then this new way of thinking about radio or delivering music or even conversation or news to people. And so this term podcast became invented, basically to describe any kind of audio program, sound only, an audio program, like a radio program, that you could package up and take with you on your iPod. Could have been music, but most often these were things like radio news shows. Some of them were fiction, but storytelling. Some were investigative journalism. Some of what we would call more things, what would we call this? Human interest stories, things like that. Imagine a show like 60 Minutes, but now produced not for television, but rather, or for even radio, but for distribution through the internet. Now that iPods are gone and people carry these little things around and we base our whole lives on our access to our phones, at least I would be lost without mine, these have kind of replaced iPods as a means by which we can access now really anything on the internet. Right? This is essentially a little miniature computer that also works as a phone. Pretty much anything that connects to the internet you can use to access podcasts, whether it's a phone, smartphone, or an iPad, or a laptop computer like this one, or even a bigger desktop computer, even your watch, right? David's the kind of guy who probably has an Apple Watch on his wrist, aren't you? You run, so you've always got devices. Maybe. If you have an Apple Watch, you can get a podcast through that watch as well. That's where I draw the line. I'm kind of trying to figure out how many devices I can or should wear. There are literally millions of podcasts out there right now. Millions. You could never find them all or listen to them all or invest in all of them, which is probably a good thing because the point of podcasting is really to find kind of a niche audience, to try to create, imagine a radio show. Right? Back in the days when people would listen to radio shows, or we still do, right? Who listens to Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me or something like that on the weekends, right? You know when that's on, or something like This American Life, or some of those shows on Minnesota Public Radio. Some of you might even get weekly or daily reports from, say, the New York Times or Washington Post. They sometimes have daily things that they will send out that just give a summary of the news. It's like watching the nightly news or the morning news, maybe through your email or through a podcast. So sometimes it's news. Again, sometimes it's fiction. Some podcasts are just individuals telling you what they think about things, if you're interested in listening to one person's opinions. Sometimes they are interviews or conversations. Some podcasts are about language learning. You can listen to a native speaker in whatever language walk you through pronunciation and how to learn a language. So they're educational. They're about delivering content, delivering opinions, delivering ideas to you. Why would you want that, you might say? Well, maybe you don't. And if so, then we've reached the end of the program that's interesting to you. Right, exactly. But perhaps it is more interesting to you because, again, there is a lot out there. Some podcasts are designed to grow businesses. They want to tell you more about their business or make you interested in their business. Some podcasts are meant to build affinity around hobbies. I recently heard of somebody who did a podcast on drones. He's an amateur drone flyer and has his own podcast about drones. Some people do podcasts just simply because they've got opinions that they want to share. Some of those people are famous. You might have heard that Barack Obama and Bruce Springsteen had a podcast for a while. Why those two together, I don't know, but it was really popular. A lot of people wanted to know, what did Barack Obama and Bruce Springsteen think about life in the United States right now? Why in the world am I here? That's a great question. Excuse me. I'm going to try to put this up. My screen is not doing what I thought it would do. There we go. Why in the world am I here? Because I've been actually doing a podcast for 14 years. This is back before it was cool. So I think I'm kind of a trendsetter in this regard. Every week, myself and a couple of the people I work with at Luther Seminary release a podcast. It's just a conversation of us sitting around talking about the Bible. You're thinking, that sounds incredibly boring. Who in the world would listen to that? Well, again, podcasts are niche audiences. There you go. Who listens to our podcast? People who have to preach. Because the podcast is designed around what we in the church call the Revised Common Lectionary. These are biblical texts that are assigned every week. At Westminster, we don't really follow the Revised Common Lectionary. We're too cool for it. But there are a lot of pastors out there who every week have got to preach on texts that have been assigned to them. And they don't always have access to resources. They don't always have access to other pastors to talk about. And so we've provided this podcast every single week. We've done over 800 of them, which is a little crazy, half-hour podcasts or 20-minute podcasts, where we simply discuss the biblical texts and give advice to preachers to think about what they might want to say around those texts. So what does it sound like? Well, here's an example. Here's the podcast that was released this week for Easter Sunday for those texts. So you'll hear a bit about how you'll kind of get a sense of what it sounds like. Give our music. Welcome to Sermon Brainwave with me, Matt Skinner.
And me, Caroline Lewis.
And me, Joy J. Moore.
We are looking at the text for the resurrection of our Lord, Easter Sunday on April 17th, 2022. Happy Easter, friends.
Happy Easter.
Happy Easter.
We'll talk more about that. Our friend Rolf is still taking some time away, but the three of us have got it under control. We are going to look at Acts 10, 34 through 43. Some churches might read Isaiah 65, 17 through 25. We're going to stick with Acts. We can only do so much. Psalm 118, verses 1 through 2 and 14 through 24. 1 Corinthians 15, 19 through 26. And because we love the Gospels so much, we're going to do two Gospel texts, Luke 24, 1 through 12, and the alternate is John 20, 1 through 18, depending upon... So there we are, just introducing the biblical text, and as we go on, it will turn into a conversation. Why would people want to listen to us? I don't know. This is one of the great mysteries of my life. I've been doing this for 14 years. I sometimes go to conferences, and people will come up to me and they'll say, "Thank you so much for doing that podcast." And I say, "You're welcome." I forget sometimes that people listen to them because I do them because it's interesting for me to sit with other people who teach the Bible or who teach preaching and just to talk about our craft, what we think we're good at or what we have strong ideas about or opinions about. And we put it out there on the internet. It's available to the entire whole wide world. But of course, only a couple thousand people listen to it, and they're all people who have pretty much the same interest. How am I going to get my sermon written this Sunday. We don't charge for it. It's accessible to anybody for free. We don't advertise on it, but our school underwrites it, and we do ask for money occasionally. I'm not here to do that today, don't worry. Other podcasts have commercials built into them, so it's more like a real radio show. These are people who are trying to make money for their own living, or perhaps just to pay for the production value. When the pandemic hit, we used to all sit around a table together and have this conversation. When the pandemic hit, we had to change that, and we all started podcasting from home or from our office. And so now this is terrifying, but we've also moved our podcast, remember I said is an audio show, like a radio show. We've moved it to video. Terrifying, right? You probably know what YouTube is. It was mentioned earlier. This is a repository online. It's a website online that has gazillions of hours of video. And so we've put our podcast there. And lo and behold, here's what it looks like for the Easter version.
Welcome to Sermon Brainwave with me, Matt Skinner.
And me, Caroline Lewis.
And me, Joy J. Moore.
We are looking at the text for the resurrection of our Lord, Easter Sunday.
So that's the exact same audio you just heard earlier. But if people want to, and we don't know why anybody would want to, but if people want to, they can watch us in person. Actually, I do know why, because sometimes video communicates more. In fact, there have been times in the last 14 years doing this podcast when people have told us things like, I've gotten emails that say, why are you so rude to so-and-so? Or why does somebody always correct somebody else? Or it seems like you're really being mean to someone. And we look at these emails and wonder what people are talking about. They can't read our nonverbal expressions, right? When we're sitting around a table having a conversation, we sometimes will signal to each other or we will wink, things like that. On video, people say, I really like watching you in 3 dimensions, which, who knows? I'll fast forward a little bit.
Of Jesus in this text, but the discovery and Luke's particular spin on it, with confusion giving way to recognition or remembrance, but also, of course, I think skeptical is too mild of a word to describe the response to the wind.
So there we are just talking about Luke 24 and what we think is going on there and what a preacher might find interesting. We don't give people sermons, we just start a conversation. One of the most rewarding things about this work is occasionally I'll run into people, either former students or other people, who will say things like, I live in the middle of nowhere and I don't have a group of fellow pastors I can talk with. I think of one former graduate who is a woman who is a Lutheran pastor in a rural part of Montana, who said to me, I have to drive at least 45 minutes to find another pastor who will talk to me because they believe it's okay for a woman to be in ministry. So you think about the isolation of some people. I have a former friend who I went to seminary, no, still a friend, but I haven't seen him for 25 years. I went to seminary with him, who is a chaplain in the Air Force National Reserve, or Air Force Reserve, and often is deployed, can't bring books with him, can't bring a library with him, and talks about how this is a great means of just connecting and just thinking about his sermon preparation, not as something he does alone, but that he does in conversation with other people. So it has that effect. In fact, here's the little, he was actually deployed to the Air Force runs an airstrip in Antarctica that sees all of the flights that scientists take in and out. So when he downloaded our podcast in Antarctica, we had hit all 7 continents, we had a little celebration for that. That was a big deal. We can track a bit of this. It's literally listened to worldwide, which isn't to say anything about me. It's to say a little bit about how do these things find their way into different audiences. Ours is not super well produced. I'm basically just sitting in front of my laptop like this, staring into the camera, as are my 2 colleagues. Other podcasts are a little more flashy. So here's an example of one. This is a podcast called Who Killed Mars Hill? This is a Christian magazine produced this podcast describing really the collapse of a very large megachurch in Seattle. And the podcast is, I think it's 11 episodes that's trying to explore in some ways, why some aspects of leadership in American evangelical churches is so toxic these days. That's the bigger story being told. But listen to how this starts. This is basically a podcast explaining why a pastor kind of collapsed and why his church fell apart. This is the very first episode. Just listen to the tone of this whole thing.
Let's begin at the end.
The thought never once came to mind that Mark would resign.
This is Tim Smith talking about events that took place in the fall of 2014. Tim was a 16-year veteran on the staff at Mars Hill, Seattle, and a longtime friend and ally of its pastor, Mark Driscoll.
It wasn't even a possibility in my mind. I'd heard Driscoll preach from the front at conferences and sermons on Sunday that he started this church, that God called him here, that he was never going to leave it, that he'd preach his own funeral, get into the casket, and close his own coffin on himself. But he's.
Anyway, just listen to the background music there. It sounds like a true crime drama, doesn't it? Right? Yeah, it sounds like that kind of thing. So podcasts have different production values. Some of them sound like a person sitting in their garage railing against the government on like an old tape recorder. Some sound like this that are much more produced with really good audio and with background music and things like that. It sounds more like investigative journalism. That's part of what they are. Sometimes they're about entertainment. They're also about delivering news. So there are various lengths. Some podcasts are just a few minutes per episode. Some can run to several hours. Some are ongoing. We've been doing ours at Luther Seminary for 14 years, and there's no end in sight because as long as there are preachers who need to preach, we figure we'll keep doing it. Some, like that one I just played the short clip from, that's just 11 episodes, and it tells a particular story, and then it's over. There was a famous podcast about 4 or 5 years ago called Serial that was put out by National Public Radio that told a kind of a murder mystery, and those are, again, just a few episodes. Kind of like a TV show, right, that might have a particular season that has a particular story arc. Some are national or international. Some are very local, right, meant to talk about kind of life in perhaps the Powderhorn neighborhood. I'm sure there's a person who produces a podcast like that. Some of them are even live and interactive, where you could call in like a real radio show, but then listen to it later. Anybody can do this, which is one of the reasons why there's so many, because it's really minimal cost. All you need is a microphone and a computer and a connection to a website that will make your podcast available. So on the one hand, anybody can do this. On the other hand, there are huge businesses devoted to cultivating podcasts and making them available, so people are making money off of this. It's like everything else on the internet, right? It opens the door to almost anybody who has something to say, but the problem, of course, then is how do you sort through the quality, right? How do you figure out what is good and what is a waste of time? Does anybody here listen to podcasts? Does anybody have experience with these or want to mention one? Can I ask just briefly which ones you've listened to? Serial. Okay, somebody who's seen Serial. Yeah. The Barack Obama and Bruce Springsteen. Right, that was called what? Renegades, Born in the USA. In the back also. Al Franken has a podcast. So many celebrities have podcasts. Yeah, Sue, do you want to I can repeat it.
He can repeat. That's up to you. There you go.
I haven't listened to podcasts because I don't know how yet.
We'll get to
That's
that.
why I'm here. But the one that has intrigued me that I've told other people about is Father Mike, talking about going through the Bible chronologically rather than by book.
Father Mike, I'm not familiar with this one, but yeah, this is,
He's out of St. Paul.
okay. This is how you learn about podcasts, as opposed to going on the web and saying, I'd like a good podcast about Christianity or something like that in your Google search, is to ask people what they listen to. It's word of mouth. It's just like how you would share information about a book that you like or a TV show that you like. So we'll talk about how to access those in just a moment. You know who else has podcasts? Good old Westminster Presbyterian Church. I don't know if you're aware of this, but if you go to, under worship, up here on their homepage and click on podcasts, lo and behold, look at this. Sunday, April 3rd, the Reverend Dr. Tim Hart Anderson. One of the ways that Westminster is kind of making its worship more accessible, not only through the live stream, but also releasing now sermons as podcasts. Some of you might remember this. It used to be that you could walk out of the sanctuary on a Sunday morning and on a table there would be manuscripts, right, of recent sermons. Nobody wants to do that anymore, right? It's a waste of paper, and so we can put them on the website. You can maybe read the manuscript. But what if you want to listen? What if you want to listen through headphones or through earbuds while you go for a walk? Or maybe you are like me. If you're going to clean the house, you're going to play music, or you're going to play radio, or you're going to play something in the background because I don't have the attention span to clean the house for very long. You could listen to, you click play.
Welcome to the podcast
Remember
of
Sarah Brower?
Westminster Presbyterian Church.
She leads
the
off
following
everyone.
sermon was delivered during morning worship at Westminster. Congregation is living out its call to be in the city.
Lord, our rock and
I just
our
moved ahead
Redeemer.
There's Tim's prayer.
Amen. If anyone to become my followers, Jesus says, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me.
So there's the sermon from 2 Sundays ago. How about that? David's in the room. I have to be really careful here about what I say. But just imagine you were too busy on Sunday morning, and imagine you just didn't have time to slow down. Or imagine you had a long drive ahead, and you thought, I want to catch up on worship at Westminster. And I'm going to just do the sermon. Right? Not the full worship service. Or how about this? Maybe you attended the worship service and you thought that was just a really moving sermon and I want to remember it and I think I need to go back and hear it a second time. There's a way you could play that through your phone, through your laptop, on demand, whenever you want. So if you're doing this and the phone rings, you click pause and it's still waiting for you when you come back. This is the crazy thing, right? Anything on television, you can watch almost anything on demand when you're ready for it. Same thing now with podcasts. So where in the world do you get these? Great question. There are a ton of places you can find podcasts. The places I've shown you so far, Westminster's website, you can go there, you click on it, it plays out of your computer. The one that I showed you from my podcast, Sermon Brainwave, is on the website Working Preacher, which is where it's housed. There are other places you can go that are kind of libraries for podcasts. Some of the most popular ones are, believe it or not, Apple Podcasts. What a surprise. If you have an iPhone, it's already preloaded on there as one of your apps. Google Podcasts, what a surprise. Google also runs the world. They have their own site called Google Podcasts. This is the homepage. It's not very splashy. I'll explain more about this in just a minute. A service called Spotify, you might be familiar with. They've kind of taken over a lot of the music on demand market. They also are a great source for podcasts. Other one called Stitcher, Stitcher, another great place. Pretty much any podcast that's made can be found on one of those 4 sites. Some of those sites are creating their own podcast, kind of like a TV channel, like if maybe you're familiar with Netflix, right? They're now making their own movies and they're making their own shows. There are some famous people who are on some of those sites. But for the most part, you can find these. You can find most podcasts in these places. So here I am on Google Podcasts. Let's just assume I'm like, I want to go to Westminster. Always happy when I spell Presbyterian correctly. Westminster Presbyterian Church. And look at that. There are something like 40 Westminster Presbyterian churches in the country, and somehow we pop up first here, which is good. Yeah, David's excited. We're number 1. And lo and behold, there's March 27th, Belonging in the Silence, Focus. March 22, Belonging in Self-Examination. You can view more. Oh, goodness, look at all these. But let's say you're like, I've heard enough of Tim Hart Anderson. I'm going to type in Westminster Presbyterian Church, Shin. There we go, February 20th. Sibling rivalry broken and restored. Yeah, the question was, it says subscribe. Does that mean the only way you can get in is to subscribe? The short answer to that is no. So I'll come back to that in just a minute. It's a great question. You notice I haven't hit subscribe anything. I haven't paid anybody any money, nothing like that. But I've been able to access this sermon from February 20th by David Sai Shin. Do you mind if I just play a few minutes? Not a few minutes, just a little bit. It's 18 minutes long. That's good. I can handle that. Skinners are always way too long. Here comes Sarah Brower.
Welcome to the podcast of Westminster Presbyterian Church. The following sermon was delivered.
You might see, on the very bottom of the screen down here, it says the title, Sibling Rivalry Broken and Restored. And then there's also you see a little triangle there for play. So I'm going to click
sermon
play.
Was delivered during morning.
And I clicked pause. But also because I know what Sarah Brower is going to say, and I happen to know where Westminster is located and all of those things, I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit. And we'll embarrass David here.
Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer.
We know how that one goes. And then starts the sermon, right, after that. So Westminster has podcasts. Why do we have those out there? Because we think some people might actually appreciate them. Right? It's a good way for us as clergy to say, this is what my preaching sounds like. If you're interested, I can send you the link to those. So this is just, if you're shopping here a la carte. Right? You just want to pick one at a time. Let me go back here to Westminster Presbyterian Church. I could hit subscribe, and what is that going to do? It means every week I'm going to get the new ones made available or perhaps even uploaded. You can set up your phone so that they're all ready to go for you. Do you see what I mean? So the difference is, what I did first was like going to the local store and buying one newspaper. Subscribe means now the newspaper is going to get delivered every day until I tell it to stop. The difference is podcasts are all free to listen to, as opposed to like buying a newspaper. How do podcasters make their money? Well, some of them have ads. Westminsters don't have ads, except we do talk about where Westminster is located and urge people to come. That's a bit of an ad, but we're not making money off of that. Some of them do have advertisements, but for the most part, this is a relatively low-cost way for people to spread content. So I want to, we have time for more questions as well. But I do want to just kind of ask the question, why are these popular? Like I said, there are literally millions of podcasts available right now. It's become, I think, especially in the last 5 years, even more popular. Partly because they're, like I said, they're relatively cheap and easy for individuals to make. Doesn't mean that they're all good, just means there's a lot out there. But why they're popular for listeners, I think, is largely about freedom. Freedom to choose what you want to listen to and when you want to listen to it. You don't have to sort through stuff that you don't want to listen to. Maybe all of your friends have said, you've got to listen to Radio Lab. This is this great podcast about science. And the people who are on it are funny. Or maybe you remember that radio show, Car Talk. Anybody ever listen to Car Talk on public radio? I loved those guys. And in fact, I try to pretend I'm them when I'm doing my own podcast, right? That was a radio show that used to be on at certain times, right? But imagine you could now say, I want to listen to that whenever I'm free. I'm going to listen to that when I'm driving to church on Sunday morning. I'm going to listen to that when I clean the bedroom on Tuesdays at 4 o'clock. That freedom is, I think, a tremendous draw, that it's on demand. You listen when you want. As well, it's a lot of it is about niche programming, right? People who are interested in the stuff that you're interested in. So if you have particular interests and you wander around the internet for a while and you find a podcast that's interesting, that's great. Maybe you want to learn a language. Another way, that's just kind of great kind of niche programming, right? You basically are creating your own radio channel that only plays the stuff you want it to play. That's why it's attractive, I think. Also, let's face it, a lot of us spend a lot more time alone these days, and especially over the last 2 years than we had previously. And so how does how does podcasting help us stay connected? In some ways, it can be like a book group where everybody's reading the same book and talking about it. Or if you and your friends are listening to the same podcast, it's one more way of finding connection during a time when life is still, at least as I experience it, tremendously isolating and sometimes difficult. Yeah, I'll just say that. And then for the purposes of the things that I care a lot about as well, faith formation, growing one's faith, how do these matter for that? Well, one of the things that I think we've learned a lot at Westminster in the last 2 years is about accessibility, is about how does the church now become accessible to people who can't be here on a regular basis. I still remember we were across the hall. This was March something, 2020. I don't usually come to staff meetings because I've got another job, but I was at this staff meeting, and it was pretty clear that we weren't going to be holding Sunday morning services for much longer. I think this meeting took place maybe 2 days before we decided to cancel the Sunday service. And I think after the meeting, Tim said to me, "What can we do for adult ed if we have to move worship online?" And I said, "We'll figure something out. We'll make it happen." And I think that Sunday I was teaching like in the garden room with a couple of potted plants behind me, just speaking to a camera, doing some kind of adult ed. In other words, this community had to learn in a big hurry, how do you switch online and how do you make what's happening in the building, worship, education, pastoral care. I'm sure David has stories to tell about this in terms of what that looks like. How do you make it accessible to people, but also make it real and make it feel like you're still part of a community, that you're not just consuming religious content, but you're participating in the life of a community? I think we're still learning about what that looks like, but that's part of why, at least the stuff I work with, adult education will continue to be offered in a hybrid format. We'll do stuff in person. We'll continue to do things online. I don't know what that means for this group, but right now, of course, this is a hybrid format. We're doing things online. People who missed this today will be able to pull up the recording and watch it whenever they want and pause it whenever they want. You in the room, you're living the good life. You get to see me in person. This is way more fun, right? So, but it's different things. Not everybody can be here, right? Because of the pandemic, because of mobility issues, because of traffic, because of the weather, because of where they live. So this is a big question for the church right now and moving forward. Even if the pandemic were to disappear tomorrow, how do we continue to be an accessible community to people who, for a whole ton of good reasons, can't be here for each and every meeting? How do we build connection? How does thinking about faith formation and the digital world help us forge real connections with other people? I think you all know this. We've got people who participate in the worship and the educational life of Westminster who live in different time zones now. How do we navigate that and still be a community? What about expertise? Where do you find expertise in certain things? Imagine you had a question and you asked everybody on the pastoral staff and they all said, "I don't know." But I could help you find an answer to that, right? This is also a thing. Just because it's on the internet doesn't mean it's good, of course. If you think that, we need to have a talk, right? A lot of the internet is full of garbage. But there's good stuff on the internet if you know where to go and to find it. And so that's also a thing. How do we find classes or lectures or help in Bible study that might be available on the web? This is what I think the church is still learning, what our community is still learning. How can we be a community that directs people to helpful resources that are out there? And maybe podcasting is one way of doing that. We've dabbled a little bit in podcasting here. I did one with Elena for a while. We're kind of rethinking how we want to do that and kind of waiting till we have some more time. But that's a different way of thinking about adult education, right? Does adult education mean you have to be here on Sunday morning at 9:15? Or is adult education something you can take with you and listen to on your phone? Right? There's pros and cons, all different ways. But how the church thinks about this on-demand programming is, I think, a really important topic that we all need to be engaged in. Sue, you've been wanting to break in, so please do.
Matt, we've got a couple of questions from
Excellent.
the live stream audience.
I'm ready for them.
The first one is, oops, and it just left. Well, the one that was here that left was whether or not the Presbyterian PCUSA has podcasts.
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
Is that a nod, Dave? They do have one?
Yes, there is. David says there are different topics and different part of the Presbyterian families. Okay.
So maybe the mission agency has one and things like that, yeah, different groups.
And then we have another question from Anne, and that is, why when you typed in Shin did only one single podcast appear? This happens a lot when I search for podcasts. How do I get to see all the episodes that have to do with the topic I write in search?
I don't know the answer to that. Do you know, David? It might be because this is a relatively new thing that we've only been putting sermons on Google Podcasts recently. That's my guess. It might be because David needs to preach more and work harder. No, I don't know the answer to that. Let's test it. Try it with Skinner. No one converts alone. That was February 6th. That's the only one for me, too. And then for Pod So Loved the World, this is the podcast that Elena and I did. I started off doing it with Sarah Brower, and then Sarah went and crossed the river and took a different call, and so Elena jumped in. We did an episode with David, did we not? We found it was too hard. It's too hard for both of our schedules to keep going, but we're going to try to find a new way to do this. So I think with the sermons, it's because it's relatively new. It's my guess about that. Any other online questions or comments? Anybody in the room? There's no question that's too uninformed or anything. We'll work through this.
So you said there was no fee when you said subscribe. You just subscribe to get those. But I had thought that if you got Spotify or whatever, that you would have to join and pay.
For Spotify, for their music, there is. So they charge for some of their podcasts, don't they? Does anybody know? Any Joe Rogan fans in the room? I hope not. But how about this? For 98% of podcasts, they're free. I'm sure there's some that have a paywall associated with them. And those are just, that would mean that, see, I didn't have to pay anything. Now I'm subscribed, which means they're going to remind me every time that a new one shows up. I'm going to unsubscribe so I don't get more email. But
Matt, if I may, I
yes,
think to Lucy's questions, there are certain podcasts, in my experience, if you subscribe to, you can subscribe with payment to avoid advertisements. That's one of the features. You can say, I want to support this podcast maker. I listened to this podcast called Asian American. It has all the Asian American latest writers for various different topics. To support them, called New Book Series, you pay a fee, and then you don't have to listen to advertisements.
Thank you for that. That's a great point. Right. So it's kind of like a different level of commitment, right?
Hi, I'm Sheila. Will these libraries that you suggested, the 4, will they learn me? Like, will they then narrow down slowly, like, what I like? Or
I think they will. Is that true? I mean, I think everything on the internet is tracking me and following me and learning from me.
You think so?
I think they do. Which just means they'll start to recommend, here are ones you might like. And so this is the reality with the internet, right? Every time you type something into Google, it is building a profile of you.
Hi, Matt. This is Chris. So I'm out in the wilderness. We camp a lot, and I want to listen to a podcast, but I don't have cell reception. How does that work? How do I get a podcast so I can?
You can download them. There's a way, like for example, if you use like Apple Podcast. I'm trying to think how to do this. There's a way you can set it to download them so that they are actually the data is then loaded on your phone.
You mean ahead of time?
Ahead of time, correct. So how can I compare this? Sometimes when I fly, I will download a movie onto my Netflix app, for example, which means the movie is contained literally on my phone, And so when they tell me to turn my phone off on the plane, I can still watch that. That data still comes through. It's a similar kind of, can you think of a better way to explain that, David?
Right, precisely. I think if you subscribe, and you can actually set it on your phone settings, your subscriptions, it will literally download every episode that's new that's when it's dropped. So again, I listen to different podcasts. I like Jonathan Capehart from the Washington Post. He will drop a new episode every Tuesday, and it will drop on my phone. So.
Just want to know, can a regular person like myself create a podcast then?
You can. I can do it. You can do it. Trust me. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
I mean, literally all you need to do is have software, like an app on your computer that will record it for you. I mean, in a way you already have that, but there are certain kinds of software you can get that will record for you. And then you need to obviously name it. And there are, like I said, there are businesses out there that are like libraries. And so the one that I've used is called Buzzsprout, where you pay a monthly fee, and they will, and you upload the audio file to them. Then they send it out to the places like Apple Podcast and Google Podcast and Spotify and things like that. So you do have production costs of your own. Exactly. If you want to make it better, you can buy a microphone that will make the audio better, or better editing software in case the dog barks in the middle of your recording or something. The Buzzsprout, that website, which, like it sounds, Buzzsprout, actually has some really good videos on it that describe how to start a podcast. They have tips, like one's hilarious. One of their tips is if you have a large closet, you should record it in there because the clothing will block out the outside sound and will prevent echoes. See, Keith in the back is probably like, that's a brilliant idea, right? Because he knows stuff about audio that I certainly don't. So it can't, yeah, and you have to find people who will listen to it, and that's, word of mouth. And
Man, I'm going to go back to the basics again.
Please.
Do I need a special app to listen to a podcast?
No, I've tried to show you that, this is just my web browser. This is, some of you use Internet Explorer, or you might use Firefox or Google Chrome, or I use a Macintosh. This is, I forgot what it's called, Safari. And this is me kind of shopping a la carte, right? This is me visiting and clicking each one. If you want a special app, then if you have an iPhone, it's already pre-installed, that Apple Podcast. Google Podcast has an app. Stitcher and Spotify have apps, which will do kind of what David was talking about. They'll let you know when a new episode is available, or they'll download it for you. Which, again, is a convenience. Are they building a profile of who you are and what you like and where you shop? Almost certainly, but...
Hi, this is Sheila. These are sort of related questions. Are podcasts rated or reviewed? And how do I avoid becoming a rabbit holer on this?
Those are great questions. Let's start with, how do you avoid becoming a rabbit holer? Do you mean by that just never getting out?
Like maybe you just have an idea about a topic, like mayonnaise, and you just start, and it's like if there are millions of podcasts, how do you use self-restraint on podcasts?
I think it's like walking into a library, or like walking into the greatest grocery store you've ever been in, and you just have to say, I've only come here for the mayonnaise. And I have to leave. And then you discover there's 50 different varieties of mayonnaise, and then you're like, I think it's partly that. And sometimes you go in with just, I'm going to explore. Like maybe you've been to a library before, and next to the book that you wanted, you see another book that looks interesting, and you grab that. So it's partly that.
And that other question about rating or reviewing.
Rating or reviewing. I don't think they're rated in terms of like rated R or PG. Is that what you mean? Those kinds of ratings, like content, quality. Yeah, there's a whole industry of people who review podcasts and tell you what's good. You can often see how many they've been downloaded, or sometimes people will have some sites will have stars. You can, like on Amazon, you can give it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stars. I don't listen to a lot of podcasts, which is, when I was asked to do this, I was like, really, me? But it's word of mouth is also really, really important, I think.
And if I may, Matt,
Please.
sometime you can also read comments on the podcast, so people leave comments.
Right, exactly. Some of them that I listen to is because my friends won't stop talking about them, and I guess I have to listen to this so I can get into the conversation, which is kind of how it works with movies as well and things like that.
We have another online question. How do they remind you a new podcast is available, and does it take up space on your phone while you're accumulating them? After you listen, does it disappear? So 3 questions.
I'm going to let David answer this one because I think he's probably going to be right off the top of his head.
So again, it's up to your settings.
Yeah.
I think this is Anne's question. And so it's up to your settings. If you set it the way that it will download, it will begin to collect on your phone. And it will take up quite a bit of memories. And so you have to go to the setting. If you have an Apple phone, then you go to the settings, go to find the particular Apple Podcast app. It will tell you how much memories it's taking up your phone. Then you will have to occasionally clean out. Just as you check out books, you got to return your books. You can think of it that way. So they freed up some space on your phone. I think I covered all the questions, right? No, it does not. So you have to manually go back to do so.
You have to clean it out. Well, this is where I can confess that when it comes to podcasts, I just go to websites and just listen to it there because partly because I'm lazy and partly because I want to avoid the rabbit hole. Like I'm the kind of person who, if I've downloaded 10 podcast episodes, I feel an obligation to listen to them. Do you know what I mean? Like I'm like, I have a hard time throwing away unread magazines, for example. Anybody else have this experience? So I've got a stack of magazines next to my bed, and then finally one day I just say, this is ridiculous. I'm going to have to throw some of these away. So that's why I am more of kind of an a la carte shopper and go to websites because I don't really have a commute and I don't listen to them like when I walk or something. I listen to them when I'm cleaning the house. Yeah, David, please.
I do have a question for you, Matt. So since you're an expert in podcast making for 14 years, that's truly cool. Literally bringing you from the 1st century to the 21st century. What do you see is going forward as an evolution or development of podcasts into the metaverse?
Oh, good grief. What's the future? I don't, when we first started doing it, I was like, I don't even know what these things are. And then, well, at one point, Dwayne asked me, he said, can you explain how these are made? Like, what goes on behind the scenes? Keith is going to laugh. I don't know. I'm told to be ready at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday, and I speak into the microphone, and then I'm done, and somebody else makes the magic out of it. So there is, if you just want to do it yourself on your own tech software, on your own audio software, it's going to sound like it. If you want one that sounds more professional, you need Keith. Or remember that Mars Hill podcast with the background music. So some of it, I think, is higher production value, where you're creating an experience. Some of you are familiar with audiobooks, and audiobooks are kind of similar. Once upon a time, they were just a voice reading like this, and then sometimes they have background music, or sometimes different voices will voice different characters. And I think podcasts are starting to do a little bit more of that they're more conversational and expertise. It's more about crossing boundaries because it's so easy with the web now, it's so easy to get 5 people in the room to talk about something because you don't have to literally be in the room. So there is some more branching out, I think, that might get us out of our silos. The question of how to make them truly interactive is an interesting question. Well, we still have radio shows like this, right? Where people will call in and they'll talk with the guest so some podcasts can do that. That, of course, rubs up against the on-demand part, right? Because an on-demand thing has to be pre-made, and to call in, you have to be there at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday or something like that. So I don't know if that's part of it. I think it's the beauty about them is because they can be made relatively quickly, and so instead of a book that I might take a year to write and then a publisher sits with for 6 months and then finally gets on the shelf and can be out of date because a pandemic comes along or something else happens that's horrible. Right, we could create a podcast right now and have it available on the web in an hour if we wanted to. You know what I mean? So there's a kind of immediacy where you can speak into a situation, which is sometimes tyranny. I don't want to always be a slave to the moment. But it's really helpful, especially in my business where you're helping pastors think of what to preach on Sunday morning. So there's been times where we've had to do podcasts like on a Friday to address something horrific that happened that week, just to say, you know, the text this Sunday raises questions about, I don't know, if I lived in Brooklyn, I would be preaching about the shooting yesterday in the subway station. You just have to, I think. So part of that is how podcasts can be more timely, I guess, or speak to the moment.
We've got another online question, and I think this one's actually for David. As far as subscribing, do you get notified by email or text, or how are you notified when a new podcast comes out?
It's your settings, right? Again, you can get a little announcement, like a little banner might pop up on your phone. I think you can set them to email too, can't you? Or sorry, the question was for you, but
Thank you both.
Again, so settings. Which.
I'm not sure about my question. It might be a little bit beyond our topic. But you began by pointing out that this is a form of broadcast media for broadcast journalism or, as you said, opinion or interest. You mentioned television and radio and YouTube. Do you think that from the standpoint of being a faith formation leader, teacher, especially in a congregational setting, that these media are, I don't know what to say, I don't mean to say successful, but are useful and faithful ways of engaging in faith formation? I mean, obviously this forum is an example that you could point to, but I'm thinking of a little bit of a longer perspective. Many people are put off by media, especially when it seems changing and new and complicated. Just the word technology sometimes sends people kind of turning the other way. Is there a way you can kind of soften this coming of this age? I mean, in all our lives, it's been around for most of our lives, a technological form of media communication. So how about this communication? Is it good news for us in the third age and going forward?
It's a great question. I think there's going to be as many answers to that as there are people in the room, but I'll weigh in what I think. How about that? It's a mixed bag, like anything else. Any technology is a mixed bag, and we have to think about how are we going to use this in ways that it doesn't ensnare us or force us into values that we don't hold and have. So I don't want to say that technology is always bad or bad for worship, right? This microphone is technology. I mean, this is useful. Could it be overdone or used in ways that aren't helpful? I'm sure it could. I prefer that on Sunday mornings, the clergy's microphones are hard to see and are relatively subtle as opposed to somebody walking around with a big microphone. You know, there's just ways we can talk about how technology gets integrated into our lives together. When it comes to faith formation, I think it's a mixed bag. I honestly don't want people worshiping only in their pajamas on Sunday morning in the comfort of their own home. I've done that during the last 2 years in particular. It was a lifesaver and a community saver, but I think in the long run, it's better to gather people in person. At the same time, some people can't. And those people have been, in some ways, forgotten by the church in years prior to the pandemic. People who kind of lived at the edges of the community because they weren't able to show up very often, And so any technology that makes the community more accessible, I think, is a potential is a good. There are also people who, for whatever reason, aren't ready to set foot inside the door of a church because of their own history or maybe their own spiritual abuse that they've suffered and that trauma. And I want to be really respectful of that and tell people you are always welcome to show up in person and be more actively integrated in the life of this community, but we're going to wait for you, and you get to do that on your own time because we recognize that's complicated for some people. So if technology widens the doors of the community or lets people test the waters, I'm changing metaphors here, then I think it's a good thing. But I would urge all of us to use it only to the extent that we need it, I guess. How about that, as opposed to somehow imagining that church is the same if we're all, quote unquote, consuming the service on a Sunday morning at our own time. Does that make sense? So, and I want there to be, I recognize people learn different ways. And so as somebody who works in adult ed, I don't want people to think the only way you can do Christian education is to show up and spend an hour being lectured at. If there are ways that we can create a 20-minute podcast that people can listen to and grow from, I think that's great. But it's knowing how you best learn and how you best hear God speaking to you, and then you use the technology to facilitate that, not to take that over. Does that make sense, what I'm getting at? Because that's kind of how I view it. And again, oops, there I am again. Again, at the seminary, you know, the technology has been a lifesaver. If this pandemic had come 20, 30 years ago, we would have had to shut down for at least a year, maybe 2 years. And maybe the church would have, I don't know what we would have done, right? But it would have been even more devastating. So I'm grateful for it, but I also don't want to get addicted to it. And now, so you mentioned for the third age, that's a big question, right? Because this is more to learn. And then if you're me, you think, I'm going to learn how to use this, and then 2 years later, something new is going to come along, and I have to learn something else. There's a bit of an annoyance there. But I would, you know, use it as you want. But it's not... Yeah, you asked me to come and talk about it, so somebody here is interested at some level, right, or just kind of curious, and to find new ways in which this opens things up. I think about, I'm not sure what age I'm in, but my kids are old enough now that I have to find things they want to talk to me about, and so part of it is watching the shows that they watch so that we have more in common, or I can't listen to the music they listen to, and they won't listen to mine, but maybe we can watch some shows or listen to some podcasts and share some conversation. That's helpful for me. I hope that gets at your question, Dwayne. It's a complicated question, but I think it's a really important one.
Well, I mean, I think that where the committee was coming from is where the committee was raising this issue, and there would be more to explore. I mean, we could produce a podcast, for example. Is it a friendly, inviting experience to offer this? I mean, in one sense, as I say, I mean, it's not all that different from television or radio,
correct,
except the use of a computer and online, networking. But it's like I'm not asking for your endorsement, but it's more like what you said. This can be a personable, peaceable community. People can speak the word of God over a podcast. I mean, we can learn. Our faith can be formed by technological media and communication. Maybe there is a lesson there to be seen and shared, which I think you put very well when you talked about talking with your children.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, because that's where Christian education or faith formation can be seen in a family or a community, as its basis and setting.
Yeah, and people are in all different places. I had a conversation with somebody, this is about 3 years ago, and I've honestly forgotten his name. I'm not sure I've seen him at Westminster since because of the pandemic. But he came to an adult ed presentation and he said, I really appreciated this. He said, I can rarely come on Sunday mornings because I'm always on the road, I'm always traveling. He said, I love listening to podcasts, though. What are some podcasts I can listen to that will help grow my theological sophistication? So that's a great question. I had to go and do some research. So, I mean, I could have said, what's the matter with you? You should come to church more often. But I wasn't going to do that, of course. But so, I mean, how we think about that. Someday, I think in the coming years, Westminster is going to have some great conversations about what did we learn during the pandemic that we want to carry forward about technology and about community. If we were saying, hey, I think we're going to become a fully online church, we're going to sell the building and go 100% digital, I think I would quit. I know I would quit, and a lot of you probably would too, but nobody's having that conversation, right? We're all trying to figure out how does technology supplement our life together or facilitate it? And that's what I would urge, I think, for your own sense of spirituality. Otherwise, we'll just create like a pastoral care app, and we'll get rid of Shin, and David can, and it can. You'll get visited by a robot, when you're in the hospital. And that's not in the works either, as far as I know. But Sue, thanks everybody.
Wow, that was very interesting. Thank you so much, Matt, for joining us. And our upcoming, next month, we've got our friend Rodney talking about Westminster's art collection. He will be bringing some of his favorite pieces in. So it might be a good time to come in person rather than on live stream, but we will try and do some close-up shots on live stream also. Excuse me. The committee will be meeting in the summer, working on programs for the next program year, which will start in September. So we will not have monthly programs for you in June, July, or August. However, I do want to invite everyone who is interested to join the committee, help us put together the programs for next year, give us ideas what you'd like. I know some of you have been emailing in some ideas, and that is great. We could also use some people on the committee. We meet once a month. It has been by Zoom, about an hour, hour and a half. So not a big time commitment, and we do have a good time. So I want to invite you to join us. Let us know, any of us, if you are interested. And now I think it's time for some coffee and conversation. We will be serving you. Andy's going to go over there and help serve, and I'm going to help serve. So hope you will stay and sit and chat amongst one another. Thank you all for coming.